Hi, team. Welcome to 10 Talks, another conversation all about implicit bias. I hope you're learning as much as I am. It is an honor and just opportunity for us to learn from our educator, Tom, who is teaching us what is implicit bias, how does it affect us, and most importantly, how can we be the agents of change that we really want to get out there and create a win-win-win for everyone involved. We are so much about solutions. We're committed to being champions for the change. And today we're going to explore really what is happening with bias and women. What can women do? What can we look out for? Really taking it beyond coaching. We've been talking about implicit bias with athletes. We've done that in a couple of our podcasts. Implicit bias for coaches. How does this interaction happen with implicit bias showing up between athletes and coaches when there's stress and when there's competition? We're going to go over all today to step into that C-suite and to step into the women that are really working in the world. And how does that get, how do we get just the effect of implicit bias in the workforce? So Tom, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for being our educator. So tell us about what shows up for women in the workforce with implicit bias.
Absolutely, Carlette. Thanks for having me yet again. So when you're talking about bias, gender bias in the C-suite, I don't want to use just C-suite. It's really any female who's in the corporate world or business world that moves from a non-leadership role to a leadership role. That's the primary risk point. As I mentioned in previous podcasts, there are three main areas of risk for women in today's world: sexualization, objectifying a woman because of how she looks and sex, etc. B is the family care, the idea of being a mom, not a corporate person, not a leader, etc. But the third one is the leadership bias. That's the thing that connects women in all managerial leadership positions to women in coaching. It's the same type of bacteria, if you will, that affects both, just flows in slightly different ways for different reasons. So in the managerial position, if you're a woman who is, either in those roles or moving into those roles, you're a woman and you're in the business world and you're climbing the corporate ladder, as they say. You're moving from customer service representative to customer service leader to customer service manager, and so on up the chain of command. Or you're starting out in a role, you're new to a company in a role. You got to think to yourself that once you move into that role, you take on a higher risk that gender bias can affect you than if you were in a different type of role. Literally, a female who is in just a general customer service role or general work type role, whether they're high level or not, is not going to be at the same high risk of leadership bias or any risk of leadership bias until she takes a step into the leadership role where she's expected to engage in disciplinary decisions, harsher decisions, more direct decisions. In other words, has to be that leader who makes tough calls. Once she steps into that role, she takes on the risk. Another way that it enters the room can be what I use the term microaggressions. Okay, people may be familiar with this. The word micro is really key because these are really small little differences and affectations and evaluations of a female that can really flow beneath the surface, largely, often subconsciously, but also just it's hard to put your finger on it. So sometimes as a woman in that role, your gut just may tell you that something is off. You don't know quite what it is. What is it? Why aren't people reacting to me in this way? I'm really trying to be engaging. I'm trying to be fair. I'm really listening to my employees, but for some reason, I'm getting negative feedback from some of your subordinates, some of your peers, maybe one of your supervisors who may have even promoted you to this position, but still is having this negative response. So what you got to remember is that the source of what's happening to you or could be happening to you is that you're required once in that role to be more direct, to be harsher, to make tough decisions. Those create this lack of fit upon you. So therefore, you're going to have some people, not all people, who could potentially have a negative response to that. They may find you a little less likable, a little less warm, so they have this body language reaction. They're also going to be doing things, for example, finding fault with you a little more quickly. For example, if you find out that your supervisor or person above you in the chain of command, whether it's supervisor or CEO, is coming to you with feedback that is negative about what he or she's been hearing about you, it can often be because of the negative responses or biases in people around you who float up to the person above you. They may not be personally having a problem with you, but they may be picking up on negative responses of others that are the result of bias. That can be a trigger point for indication of bias affecting you. It can also be from a number of, you may see it in meetings. People may respond to you differently in a meeting, may have different body language, but also it's picking up on negative things, but it's also muting the positive. For example, a female, you may think to yourself, my gosh, I'm moving into the VP role. I'm going to kill it here. I'm going to knock it out of the park. I know I'm doing everything right. But for some reason, nobody seems to recognize it. Nobody seems to acknowledge it. And you know you're a person who doesn't, you're not narcissistic. You're not the person who needs feedback and love and affection every 5 seconds. You got where you are by being independent, but even your limited need for feedback and positive feedback is not being met because individuals are either taking it for granted, very common response to a female leadership role, or just they're not recognizing it. They're picking up on the negative, but they're not, as small as it is, but they're not recognizing the positive. So these are just a number of ways that a woman in leadership within business can recognize how bias could be in the room. And I call them microaggressions to collect them generally, but that's kind of what they are. They're these micro level decisions that don't seem to make a lot of sense, that make you feel negatively about your work experience, but that don't appear connected to your actual performance.
So let's talk about how women win in terms of being authentic. So how can I, as a woman, really be set up to own my authentic self as a nurturer? I mean, I definitely want to be liked and kind, and we all have that. I think male and female certainly have that component, and be able to step into my strength of being able to own decisions that I make. And is there a winning strategy around how that's delivered, or kind of how we do this inside understanding that there is a bias?
Sure. I think the first thing I want to say to you and your audience is that I believe strongly that women should be permitted to be their authentic selves and not have to sit around and worry and wonder how they're behaving and how people react. That is not fair for you to have to do that. I know it's the reality of your world, and a lot of women are already subconsciously accommodating the bias risks. I'm certain of it. That's what really I empathize with, or I can see in women who talk to me in whether my lawyer capacity or just this capacity. Just like I know you're already doing everything you can to kind of weird way accommodate the thing. You are trying to be more nurturing, even though technically your role doesn't require it, then you should be, but you know you do it, you make those efforts. But in terms of the individual female, if you're seeing these microaggressions or seeing these challenges, the first step is to take a step back and go take some accountability for yourself and say, do I think this is happening to me? All right. Do I think that if I were transformed into a male this tomorrow, would these behaviors continue, or would these behaviors reduce or stop? If the answer is honestly yes, I think that if I were transferred into a male tomorrow, things would change, then you're on the right tracks. And the question is, what do you do about it? How can you engage? I think the way to do it is to put yourself, first of all, in the shoes of the person you're going to talk to. Your female boss or your male boss, either one, if you were in their shoes and you said, someone below you came up and said, hey, I believe my gender may be influencing what's going on around me, how would you want that to be presented to you, right? What would you want them to say? You know you're going to have a defensive response because you're a woman and you're thinking, well, I don't discriminate against women, right? Or if you're a man, you're thinking, I don't discriminate against women either. And so how do you talk about it? Here's what I suggest, and I use this sometimes, I suggest this for women and for African Americans and other groups in certain similar contexts. Talk about it in terms of, you've been doing research. You've reached out and you've discovered that there's some issues within the working world today facing some women that you think might be relevant to what's going on in this workplace. You'd like to talk to them about it. In other words, don't make it about, I'm seeing problems, I'm complaining about problems right away. Say that I've heard about these issues facing women. Let's talk about it. I've actually had some experiences that kind of mirror that what the experts are saying. Could we talk about it? Could we bring in someone to talk about it? Could we bring in a speaker on it? Could we specifically train people on this issue? Try and deal with it that way. Then you can also be a little bit more direct to people above you. You can say, specifically, I'm a little concerned with that. I think some of the negativity that you're seeing about me is being reported differently because I happen to be a female in this role, not accusing anybody of sexism or being hating women. You always offset it with that. But I am concerned that I'm being evaluated slightly differently. And that's why I use the phrase implicit bias a lot, because I think it's a less defensive triggering term than saying I'm being treated differently because I'm a woman. I'm being discriminated because I'm a woman. Because you may not be. It's hard.
Mhm.
You may be a woman who just got promoted
Mhm.
to making $200,000 a year, and you're concerned about the negativity that no one else around you can see. That this is a couple of ways that you could deal with it as an individual. Okay, so that's what I would say in response to, for women who are looking for how can I have these conversations. Put the onus of the conversation on that you've been doing research, you listened to some experts, you heard about some things, you heard a speaker talk about it, and you want to bring that knowledge into the corporation and as a whole. And then you can make it more personal from there.
Well, Tom, I really value that, because that's being the solution, right? We really value recognizing the problem and also bringing the solution. And that is really our desired outcome as to why we're doing these conversations, just to be part of that solution. So as we get ourselves set up to really advocate for us versus advocating against somebody else, again, very much anchored in solutions. We want a win-win-win here. Whoever's involved, we never want to be against someone. And I have found that to be really interesting in terms of how quickly women can turn on women, and they can make it about the other woman versus about the implicit bias. Do we do that because we're not aware of the bias and we just need a response? We're looking for some reason. What happens there?
Well, I think what you're saying has some ring of truth to it. I think that it's really a lack of education on how bias works. I mean, what I always say to individuals is that just because someone is female does not mean that she has any particular knowledge of how bias works. She's either been educated on it or she hasn't. She may have experienced bias. There's no question about that. But whether she's aware of how it works, right? And the same is true for an African American. Just because someone's Black does not mean that they're innately imbued with specific knowledge of all the forms of bias that exist in society, even though he or she may have experienced it. And so those are things to think about. I don't know. I think that people can conflict with each other and can get harder on each other. In particular, women might be harder on each other, or sometimes even African Americans can be harder on each other. And I think that, if I may, as a person who is the epitome of the in-group, the 58-year-old white heterosexual male professional, it's to some extent the world that people who looked a little bit more like me have creates a system where women tend to be pitted against each other a little bit by that system, and African Americans and other groups can be pitted against each other slightly too. And so I just always encourage, and I've seen this happen all the time, it's like I'll say to a group of women in a certain situation, whatever you do, don't be negative toward each other, because the system does turn you on each other a little bit. It just does naturally. And you need to not do that. And you need to educate yourselves on how bias works to know that you can hold bias just like your male counterparts can, but also to make certain that you are objectively judging your fellow females appropriately to measure their quality and their worth without judging them overly based on maybe what they're wearing that day, or how they look that day, or whether their hair is particularly well done that day. Those are important things for women to do as well.
Well, a lot for us to figure out as we figure out ourselves and also just this new education. Let's talk about our desired outcome of really the power of team, igniting the power of team so that we can create this win-win-win. And when we talk about the team, it's really this team of people committed to being the solution and the agents of change here. So what are the winning strategies for getting this team set up for great success?
Sure. And I think that the team idea came about as a result of your and my conversations a little bit, and from two perspectives. One is that the science shows that implicit biases can be reduced over time, but they're very slow. For example, in the last 15 years, our biases toward sexual orientation, toward gay and lesbian individuals has actually reduced as a society, but it's still there. But it's very slow. And the science says that training, you can't train bias out of someone. So the thing is, if these trainings or these HR presentations are useful, they raise awareness, but they're not really solving the problem. And so what's a better solution? Something that, and I think the answer is in fact the team approach. And we kind of came up with this thought of, the team approach based on the sport analogy, that if for a coach who's female, she naturally has a group of people who are part of her team that will include the medical care, the trainer, the training, the assistant coach, administration to some extent, and the team itself. There's a group of people around that individual who can become part of the solution. In the C-suite context, it's a little more complicated normally, but you need to think of it as if you're a female who's at risk, that you're not on your own. For example, let's go collect the team. Let's start with other women who may be in leadership roles who might be interested in having this conversation. Start a group of awareness to make certain that this team of people you can depend upon who have a slightly higher level of knowledge of this risk. Then you can get HR involved or compliance involved in your organization to say, I know you're doing training and education. We'd like to expand it and increase it in this particular area and make certain that when these microaggressions come up, we have a solution in place, which means we have a team we can go to say, here's what happened. Do we think this could be a result of gender bias in some subtle form? How do we handle it? As opposed to the normal process, which is female has to experience it, put up with it, never do anything about it, or get fired as a result of it, or go see a lawyer about it, which makes it polarizing and negative rather than the win-win-win that you hope for and that we all hope for. Because at the end of the day, what this team approach can be far more effective at actually solving and reducing the problem. But I also encourage women everywhere to realize that just because you haven't instantly experienced it today doesn't mean that it's not coming. And so anticipate this risk and develop your team now within your organization to deal with what I will call the more subtle forms of bias that can interfere with full equality for certain groups. You can call it implicit bias or whatever you want to call it, but it's the more subtle stuff, the microaggressions, because that's the thing that causes most of the harm and is the most challenging thing for an employer to deal with generally, but has the most potential to open up a whole new world for equality for women and other groups as well.
Well, what's beautiful about this is that it's all about really championing each other and also championing the change and being proactive with it. As soon as you are in a place of leadership, connect with the other women that are in leadership and begin to really talk about, as you've said, the policy or the procedures or the how we want to do this. And to be able to start from an educational perspective, just being able to form this team that says we care about this being the change and we're committed to practice it. In sport, we would never say we care about something and never show up to practice. So that's really the gift of this new thinking, is that it isn't just a one-time training that you have us or somebody else come in and talk about. Mm-hmm. It's about that you start with the training so that you understand the game we're playing here. The game we're playing is about implicit bias. And then we want a team of people that are committed to really practicing it so that it becomes a change. And the real gift around this, to have that win-win-win, is to have the coaches have a team, have the athletes have a team, have the administration have a team, have the C-suite have a team, have managers have a team, right? I mean, just the gift of everybody saying, we care about this, and it will elevate every component because we're for the solution rather than managing a problem. And it is something that affects all of us from a perspective of male or female or daughters or whatever age we're in. What a gift for us to be on the journey to really be the change. And Tom, we're very grateful for the education that you've given us to be able to start the process. I know that you and I have made a commitment to really be part of the training, be part of the coaching, be part of the change and what people need. We're here to be on your support team and really start to educate and understand, and most importantly, train to be different and make that commitment. So Tom, thank you so much for the journey of this collection, really, of podcast conversations. And I know we're just beginning, and so to be continued as we commit to being the change.
Thank you very much, Carlette. It's a pleasure to engage in this and look forward to our further collaboration.
So team, it's up to you. Go out and be a champion for the change that matters to you. Be a champion for making sure that we change this. We have the power. We're starting to get educated. It's just the beginning, which is really exciting. And let's figure out the problem, be part of the solution, and champion being the change. Thank you very much for you and all that you're doing. And Tom and I look forward to being on your support team. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, Carlette.